Hello everyone, welcome to Reading Culture. Today we're going to be looking at really our first literary text. In the previous videos, we have been introduced to the ideas of culture, of heroism. We've looked at Plato to help us think about how to not get bogged down in particulars and to look at universal ideas of concepts like heroism. We looked at Aristotle to avoid not falling into perhaps false universals or the personal reflection, and instead looking at the particulars of how we can analyze character and narrative. But today we're going to get an introduction to what will really be our first literary work. But it does require an introduction. Indeed, it may prove in some ways one of the most difficult things that we look at in this exploration over the coming months. So what is this text? The text itself is The Stories from the Six Worlds, Mi'kmaq Legends, by Ruth Holmes Whitehead. Now, Ruth Holmes Whitehead did not just make up these stories and write them down. She's really an editor or translator or compiler, right? She's really bringing myths and compiling them together. And in that way, she's acting as a mediator. But it seems that she really did try to minimize her level of mediation to the degree that she could. If you would like more information on how she actually went about this process, you can see in the appendix of the book, she not only describes her sources, but she describes her methodology in terms of how this came about. But before we actually get into the specific stories themselves, it really is necessary to, I think, provide a bit of an introduction. And the introduction that she provides is very useful. So I'm really going to kind of go through that introduction, offer some commentary on it, hopefully help you get an idea of how we can approach these stories, which may be very, very different to the kinds of stories with which we are familiar. Right, so to start off, these are the myths of the Mi'kmaq people, who are an indigenous people whose traditional lands are now encompassed by eastern Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, parts of Quebec, and New England as well in the United States. Now, their name for themselves is very common in colonized places, that you have a name given to people, and then the name that they call themselves is, as with all of the Mi'kmaq words, please forgive my pronunciation. The name for themselves is Lunuk, which means the people or human being. This is very, very typical. The traditional names that people have, right, their original names for themselves usually is always something like the people or human beings or real people. Maybe quite shocking to us, it's very tribal. The idea that we're the people and everyone else is something foreign. But it is the traditional way that most people conceive of themselves. And maybe keep that in mind as we go through. So the Mi'kmaq were an oral people prior to European settlement. They preserved their own stories and mythologies through oral transmission, right, generation to generation, handing down the same stories by word of mouth. They'll change. And of course, also, most of this is now lost. This is always the case with oral tradition, but particularly with a situation like you have in Eastern Canada, where you have a really rapid kind of loss of that kind of oral culture. So we're really only getting the bare bones here, the kind of bits and pieces. Moreover, many of their stories and myths were mediated by European interlocutors who may not have possessed a full understanding of their culture. So they may not even have been deliberately trying to, alter or change things, but simply through not understanding what is a very foreign culture to them, right, inaccuracies may have crept in. And this is something that, again, Whitehead talks about as a difficulty with anyone trying to compile these things. Nevertheless, we do possess stories that originate from the Mi'kmaq themselves. We know that these stories actually come from them, right? They aren't ascribed to them or added later. And they have their own mythological world, right? The mythological world of the Mi'kmaq is one that's full of fluidity and shape-shifting, right? Things aren't static, right? Characters can change form in any number of ways. And the narratives themselves may not follow logically according to our modern perception or accord with traditional Western storytelling conventions. Right? Sometimes things may seem kind of broken, it's just jointed to us, who are not used to oral storytelling, and particularly from a very different culture. It must be noted, of course, that we are reading only the translation into English of these stories, and something is always lost in translation. particularly insofar as the Mi'kmaq language is in fact a very different language from English, and there's a lot of you can convey meaning in a very different way in that language. So the multiple levels of symbolic meaning in the original language may not always be fully transferable to English, though of course the translators do their best. The symbolic world of these myths is a world where some people possess what is translated as the power, with a capital P. It's not just any kind of power, right? It's the power. And this is a power that they can exercise by their will. This power, it's related to the power of creation itself. It seems to be by this power that the world was created by the Creator. And with this power, humans can take the shapes of animals. But we also have animals becoming people, right? Again, it's this fluid world. So animal, human persons abound. The bear person, right, or the Wolverine person, right? These are not simply um, one thing looking like another. Really is a kind of hybridity, right? Again, a fluidity of form. There are also objects of power in the world as well, and a lot of these objects of power seem to relate indeed to very, very ancient traditions that we can even find in East Asia. Right? It's a very, very primordial, almost kind of mythological conception. And indeed, what the modern person might consider an inanimate object may be ensouled, as it were, in the stories. So stars, for instance, can be persons. You can come down, you can talk to them. Indeed, much of the natural world is personified in the stories. Right? There's very little that doesn't seem to be capable of taking on the aspects of a person, even rocks, in some sense. Sometimes a rock could be something that you could talk to. So in this sense, the whole world is numinous, right? So numinous meaning full of a kind of divine power, right? It's not just manifested in a god or a demigod or some kind of mythological creature, though it may be. It really is. The entire world is full of this kind of spiritual power. And of course, you also have spirits in a kind of ghostly sense inhabiting the world as well. And people may become these kinds of beings through the power, right? These kinds of spirits. And even it seems that even time itself can be altered. Again, it's there. The kind of linear progression of the narrative is not always present, and a lot of times it does seem like time is not fixed in perhaps the way that we would expect it to be in a more modern narrative. So this power itself is often encountered in the depths of the forest, which is representative of chaos, right? It's darkness. And you can imagine that the symbol of the tree really uniting three of the worlds. Right? You have the underworld, right? The roots of the tree go down under the earth into the underworld. You of course have it in the earth, but also it branches up into the sky. In this sense, it's an image uniting all of these worlds together. Indeed, this idea of a world tree, a tree which holds up the world, is really a universal image of cultural manifestation that's found all over the world. Of course, in Old Norse and probably in other ancient Germanic societies, you had this idea of the world tree, Yggdrasil, right? The tree that holds up the world on which Odin sacrifices himself. Even indeed in the Christian tradition, you have right the tree of good and evil and the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, which ultimately is tied in with traditions relating to the cross upon which Christ dies. This idea of the tree is really, again, culturally transcendent. So when you see trees functioning in this way, take note, because it may be telling us something about the reality of their world. But the symbolism of the tree is also intimately connected to shamanism. Shamanism, of course, is uh, a very typical kind of religious expression in these kinds of pre-agrarian societies. Thus, the tree and shamanism, power and chaos, are associated with the forest. It's where you go away from civilization, perhaps you could call it, though that may not be a very apt word, um, to go into the kind of dark wilds where unknown things lurk. The forest, in that sense, also represents antiquity, right? Is the place where the old ones reside. You enter into the forest, you enter into an ancient world before the peoples left the forest. So these worlds also, it seems in mythology, may have been made by the sun, right? The sun is personified as a being that created the world. But there's also a sense that the people themselves sprung from the earth, right? They come out of the earth. There's this interesting synthesis in that the earth, the moon, and even the sun itself are seen as the ancestors of the people, as though they are descended from them. And the same power, the earth that, right, the sun, the moon has, and the earth itself, and the people have, right? That's the same power that infuses them all. So some of the people who have the power, they seem akin to the ancient Greek heroes who were demigods, right? We talked in the video about the origin of the word hero, how originally, right, it meant someone with, superhuman strength and ability, right? In the ancient Greek mythological tradition. Again, a kind of demigod like Hercules or Achilles. So in some cases, people in these myths who have the power seem like that, but in other cases, very much not so. Sometimes someone who has the power can manipulate reality. Other times, they can predict the future. But there's also a sense that this power binds the worlds of life and death. So you have the world of the living and the ghost world, the world of the dead, but they're not truly separated because the same power infuses them all. And in that sense, the dead, and as this is more clear in the Mi'kmaq language, the dead are not merely uh, lost forever. It's more like they're absent. And indeed, we'll see in some of the stories that death is not always a permanent state in the world of the living in some stories, right? Sometimes we see reincarnation or things like that. Indeed, we even see inanimate things take on new life, scattering of bones that turn it into mosquitoes or something like that. And again, the shape changing, right, is ever present. And not just people and animals, but even, again, these changes in more dramatic form. One of the things I think that would be very useful to consider as you enter into these myths is to note the lack of metaphor. Metaphor being, right, a simple, right, comparison without like or as in that sense. Uh, oh, I see. The image there in the myth is just a metaphor for this thing. No, in these myths, all these images are real. They're as real as anything. Now, in the introduction, Whitehead also argues that there's a lack of heroes in the European sense. Now, we're looking at this within the context of uh, a broader discussion of the hero and heroism. So that's a very interesting statement. And as you read throughout, I would like you to think about if you agree with that. First and foremost, do you agree that in the European sense there's a lack of heroes, or do you think there is? If you agree that there is a lack of heroes in the uh, European sense in the myths, then I would consider asking yourself, are there heroes in a non-European sense? And if there are, what are those like? Because it's a very different world to the one that we are probably familiar with. So, for example, in some of these stories, it seems that even cannibals could potentially be sympathetic. Now, this idea of the power, too, some are given the power, right? It seems in some cases perhaps they earn it. Others are merely born with it. Does that make them a hero? I don't know, right? Though the power is often tied to objects as well, as we talked about. For instance, take note of the use of right? Especially garments of skin, right? The skin of animals, right? They're symbolic markers of identity and power, particularly for shamans, right? And remember, the clothing is technological, right? It's a human technology, right? Like armor is an artifice, but it's also a an identifier of various kinds of identity. But note that identity in these myths is also communal. The entire tribe, in some ways, may share an identity, and thus you will see in some of the stories that revenge against entire groups, even leading to what we would consider almost like a genocide, right? The wiping out of women and children of an entire tribe, right? It's not necessarily, it seems within the narrative, portrayed as vicious. Right? It seems to be congruent with the overall philosophy of identity. But of course, revenge often comes through power, the power, right? Capital P. But this power also comes through relationships, filial and spiritual. So sometimes you have animal helpers that are involved. You also have many tales of a man seeking a wife as a helper, sometimes unsuccessfully, sometimes not. Indeed, many stories are about acquiring wives. But many of these stories of acquisition also include failures, but sometimes the failure itself may lead to transformation, at least with the help of a spirit helper or something like that. But it's important to note that this possession of the power can also lead to isolation. So if some people who possess the power must leave the community and go deep into the forest. As we've talked about, the forest is a perilous place full of spiritual uh, entities and chaos. And that's worth thinking about. As we try and analyze these myths, it's worth thinking about how they're constructed. Right? So think about things like in the introduction, Whitehead argues that these myths are locked into ethical ideas. Right? Things like power comes through silence. But of course, many stories don't end happily, and particularly if that silence about the power is broken. In other words, much can be lost by revealing what should not be revealed. So, in other words, even if it seems to the modern reader like these stories are divorced from any kind of ethical context, it's worth considering that perhaps they are just one that may be foreign to the one with which we are familiar. Now, if that's true, then it becomes a question: how can we analyze it for purposes of a discussion of heroism and the hero? Can we? Right? Is it a fruitless task to try and impose this idea into it? But if we think about one of the definitions of hero, that which is noble, laudable, right? A protagonist with which we are meant to sympathetically identify, then it seems that these stories are not necessarily beyond the reach of that approach. So these stories, even though they're complex, right, even for the reader that's uninitiated in Mi'kmaq culture, right, meaning can still be found in them. Right? You just have to look really into the text and not simply gloss over it as being something that's very strange. It's important to note that, again, this is myth, and myth always transcends culture. Right? So I already talked about this idea of the tree, the world tree, right? That transcends just Mi'kmaq culture, right? It's a part of our primordial experience of the world, right? These living things. Similarly, in the myth of the creation, in these Mi'kmaq myths, you see the creator breathing life into an image, just like in Genesis in the Christian Bible, right? You have God breathing life into Adam. These aren't coincidences, right? These are, again, manifestations of some kind of reality within the culture of myth itself. I would suggest that when you read these myths, that you should listen to the words in your mind and imagine that you are in the presence of an ancient storyteller and you're being told a very, very old and ancient story from before even recorded time, so old and so ancient that perhaps in some cases its meaning has already been lost. That if you look hard enough, you can see the reality behind the myth.